Tibetan Buddhism is a form of Buddhism with a rich history from its practice in Tibet and Mongolia. It is also found in surrounding areas of the Himalayas, including Indian regions, Bhutan, and Nepal, as well as groups in Central Asia. Tibetan Buddhism evolved as a form of Mahayana Buddhism, springing from the latter stages of Indian Buddhism that encompassed many elements of the Vajrayana tradition. Formally dating back to the 7th century CE and largely influenced by the Indian sage Padmanabhasa, Tibetan Buddhism has evolved into a complex and diverse system of spiritual and philosophical practices that are deeply rooted in Tibetan culture. Tibetan Buddhism faced significant challenges in the 20th century due to the Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1950. Because the persecution has continued, Tibetan refugees fleeing Chinese oppression brought the Tibetan Buddhism to the Western world. The vibrant history, beliefs, and practices of Tibetan Buddhism have intrigued many, leading to its growth in the United States. In this look at Tibetan Buddhism, I will examine the topic of liberty and how it plays a key role not only for the Tibetan Buddhist who finds sanctuary in America, but also for the American follower who finds liberation in the teachings and practices of this religion. Exactly how this liberty is transmitted, preserved, or restored will affect the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism in the United States, as it is likely to be increasingly influential in the spiritual landscape of America. Many centuries ago, a writer observed, "To each generation is assigned the natural duty of instructing the next, and has made each succeeding generation the criterion of truth of the information handed down to it. For hearing many unusual traditions and strange ideas makes the mind more acute, enriches the soul, and gives food for thought and incentive to look ahead." To begin, it is worthwhile to understand that Tibetan Buddhism evolved in the culture of the harsh climate of the Tibetan Plateau. Many today associate Tibet with Buddhism. However, it was also once a land with great systems of warriors and chariots, castles and temples, priests and priestesses. A civilization born some 3,000 years ago, it developed aggressively elite political alliances, organizing society into tightly run administrative and military divisions, in which loyalty and honor were among the most cherished values. Within this culture, Tibetan Buddhism evolved from Vajrayana Buddhism, the diamond vehicle, which can be traced to northern India. It is seen by some as an extension of Mahayana and by others as its own distinct Buddhist vehicle. However, it was in Tibet and some close-by regions of Central Asia that Vajrayana seriously advanced, intermixing with indigenous shamanic religions. Tibet existed as an independent nation which had little contact with the outside world. Religion was a unifying theme among the Tibetans, as was their worldview developed by living at high altitudes under harsh conditions in a balance with their environment. All of this came to an end with the communist Chinese invasion in 1950, causing much turmoil, overthrowing the Tibetan government, and prompting the self-imposed exile of the Dalai Lama and over 100,000 Tibetans in 1959. The Organization of Students for a Free Tibet has worked diligently over the last few decades to bring the issues that have affected Tibet into public awareness. They have called attention to facts such as over 1 million Tibetans killed. The policy of resettlement of Chinese to Tibet has made Tibetans a minority in their own country. Chinese is now the official language. Only 1/20th of the monks are still allowed to practice. Up to 6,000 monasteries have been destroyed. Famines have appeared, natural resources and wildlife devastated, and the Tibetan culture has come dangerously close to being eliminated. Many that protested within the country have been arrested and held as political prisoners in brutal conditions, with little hopes of their liberty being restored. A subsequent diaspora of Tibetans began to seek refuge in America during the 1960s and 1970s. These refugees, including high-ranking lamas, brought their religion and culture with them from their homeland. Of particular importance to the Tibetan tradition is the belief that highly realized teachers, after death, have the ability to purposely incarnate in a providential situation. The purpose is to continue their compassionate work without forgetting the accomplishments of their previous lives. The reincarnate custodians carry with them specialized lineages of teachings in Tibetan Buddhism. Called takus, they have a highly valued place in Tibetan culture, which was evident when the Chinese began their occupation. While they systematically smuggled texts and sacred relics and ritual implements from the country into India, they especially insisted that the living holders of oral instructions of meditation lineages be escorted out of the country, living treasures of Tibet. Due to the diligence of the lamas, the transmission of Tibetan Buddhism by Tibetans to the United States began to make significant progress in the early 1970s. America was thought of by some to be the next open frontier for the continuation and development of acclimatized teachings of the Buddha. One of the earliest Tibetan Buddhist centers in America was the Karmajong Center in Boulder, Colorado, founded in 1973 by Chongyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Over time, more Tibetan Buddhist centers were established, including the Sarah Monastery in California, founded by Geshe Gyaltsen in 1982, and the Garshan Institute in Arizona, founded by Garshan Rinpoche in 1998. However, one of the most high-profile Tibetans to go into exile was the first to settle in the United States. His name was Thubten Jigme Norpu, also known as Tagster Rinpoche. When the army of the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet, Tagster Rinpoche, aged 27, was the abbot of Kumbum Monastery. Kumbum was also known as the birthplace of Lama Tsongkhapa, who was the founder of the Gelugpa sect, Yellow Hat, of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the residence of the previous Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas. It was in 1950, after he warned his younger brother, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, of the seriousness of the Chinese invasion, that Norbu left Tibet. In order to attempt to educate the world about the injustice in Tibet, Norbu frequently lectured about the situation in many countries and served as professor of Tibetan studies at Indiana University. At the request of the Dalai Lama, he founded the Tibetan Cultural Center in Bloomington, Indiana in 1979. The center would eventually be expanded to include Mongolians, as the Tibetans felt it was appropriate to include their culture and struggles. The mission of the Tibetan Mongolian Buddhist Cultural Center includes fostering cultural exchange between Tibetans inside and outside of Tibet, as well as fostering and preserving Tibetan and Mongolian cultures in the USA and providing education in these cultures in the Bloomington community. Over the last few decades, the Tibetan tradition has increased its presence in the United States. Many schools that offer courses in Buddhist studies are close to an American Vajrayana center. However, religious studies professor and author Amy Levine finds that in her research of American Tibetan communities, most ordinary Tibetans do not meditate, and they consider their own religious practices limited to chanting prayers and caring for a personal shrine. She goes on to state that the participants in far more elaborate monastic religious practices are far more characteristic of the American Vajrayanists than of lay ethnic Tibetans. Today there can be found in almost American state some type of study center characterized by each of the four main orders of Tibetan Buddhists, as well as publishing houses that are dedicated to creating accurate translations of text and liturgies. Pew Research studies show that Americans are far more religious than adults in other comparably wealthy states. In 1966, Time magazine famously examined whether the United States was on a path to secularization when it published its now iconic Is God Dead cover. Yet the question now seems rash, as the U.S. has continued to practice and combine religion at rates higher than many other Western democracies. The liberating changes that the United States saw during the decades of the 1960s and 1970s helped create a space for a more philosophical approach to religion that focuses on the individual rather than emphasizing theology. It is interesting to note that despite the non-theistic focus of the Buddhist religion, there are many shared values that can be found with other religions, particularly ones that have a strong mystical tradition. The American Catholic monk Thomas Merton took a special interest in Buddhism and Tibetan practice. He met with the Dalai Lama in the late 1960s. The emphasis that the Dalai Lama placed on dedication in the spiritual life, the need for experienced guidance, discipline, and wisdom made a great impression on Merton. The research of Levine reminds us that the creation of innovations that will translate both the letter and spirit of its doctrines and practices to this new social, political, cultural, and psychological landscape is among the most challenging tasks for the follower of American Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism will undoubtedly grow, connecting more audiences and practitioners, especially through the internet. It will be interesting to see how the rich history of Tibetan culture continues to be preserved in America while the land of Tibet continues to struggle for religious liberty and freedom. In the last presentation he gave before his death, Thomas Merton made a striking observation on the shared view of Tibetan Buddhism and Christianity. That if you penetrate by detachment and purity of heart to the inner secret of the ground of your ordinary experience, you attain to a liberty nobody can touch, that nobody can affect, that no political change of circumstance can do anything to. Behind these two traditions is the belief that this kind of freedom and transcendence is somehow attainable.